When my son told me I didn't fit the vibe of their family's Christmas dinner, I nodded, left his house in silence, and started pulling up every single bank statement. 2 days later, I canceled the entire mortgage payment that was in my name. That was just the first step. They thought I would continue to swallow my pride. They were wrong. A carefully prepared plan was set in motion, not for revenge, but to force those who live on the backs of others to face the truth. And you won't believe what happened on Christmas Eve. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. I could make my famous turkey this year, I said, sinking deeper into the leather armchair in my son's living room. The one with the sage stuffing your mother used to love, remember? She used to say it was even better than your grandmother's. My words faded into the warm air, mingling with the scent of expensive vanilla candles. A nearly 12-foot-tall Christmas tree sparkled in the corner, its lights reflecting off the wedding band on Eric's finger. He shifted slightly. His shoulders tensed, as if bracing himself for what he was about to say. Then, he lowered his voice. "Dad, maybe you shouldn't come this year." I blinked. "What?" He wouldn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on the marble-paneled TV stand, a piece I had helped pick out when Vanessa decided the old one no longer fit their aesthetic. You know, Vanessa's parents are coming, and they'd feel more comfortable if you weren't there. My hands grew cold. They'd feel... It's just to make things simpler, Dad. Their family has their own way of doing things. I looked around the room, at the imported Roman blinds I had paid for, the white oak ceiling installed with a second loan, the cream-colored 3D wall panels I'd covered with my maxed-out credit card. Everything in this house had my fingerprints on it. And now, I was the one who wasn't allowed in. Their own traditions, I repeated, and I'm not in them. Dad, don't make this more difficult. Through the kitchen archway, I saw the automatic espresso machine, the one Vanessa had insisted on buying back in October. She said it was to treat herself for the holidays. 2,000 of my dollars sat there, probably used only a handful of times. So, where am I supposed to have Christmas dinner? He looked down. Maybe you could go to Aunt Clara's, or I can come over later on the weekend. The weekend after. As if Christmas were just another appointment you could reschedule. I stood up. My knees reminded me that 8 years of carrying their weight hadn't been easy. I understand. Dad, I was already at the door, walking past the picture frames where my face had grown smaller and smaller over time. Past the smart shoe rack and coat hanger, filled with Vanessa's choices, with no room for my old boots. My hand rested on the doorknob. Without turning back, I said, "Tell her parents." A beat. Feliz Navidad. The December air of Knoxville hit my face as I stepped out to my car. Behind me, I heard my name called once. Then the decisive click of the door closing. I sat in the car, the engine still off, looking at the Christmas lights from the houses I knew I no longer belonged to. My phone vibrated. It was probably him. Or Vanessa. I didn't answer. I drove away from the warm glow of the house I'd helped build, but had never been invited into as a father. I turned right at the intersection of Eastland and Maplewood. Red light. The car stopped, but my mind was racing. Warm yellow light spilled from the houses. The shadows of trees leaned across the sidewalks. A father was tying a gift to the roof of his SUV while 2 kids pressed their faces against the window, laughing and talking excitedly. A normal December scene. One that used to be mine, used to be Eric's. Before everything started to smell like money. I used to be that man. I used to wrap the car in red ribbons, and I knew the feeling of my son running to the door, holding a handmade card, his eyes sparkling just because of a box of gingerbread cookies his mom had baked. Now, what was I? A shadow in his house. An automatic bank transfer. An inconvenience. I pressed the gas pedal harder than necessary when the light turned green. The car grumbled softly, as if in agreement. The next turn took me toward Oak Ridge Central, where I had signed the first stack of mortgage papers for that house. I vividly remembered the bank officer hesitating before asking, "Mr. Moore, are you sure? This is a significant amount for a property not in your name." I had smiled faintly then. "It's for my son. It's an investment in his future." Now I understood. I was the only one investing. 3 blocks later, I drove past the Oak National Bank headquarters, where I signed for the second mortgage when Eric was unemployed 2 years ago. "It's just temporary, Dad," he'd said. Vanessa stood behind him, a designer bag on her arm, her hand on his shoulder as if offering comfort, or putting on a show. She said nothing, but her eyes asked, "So, how much do you have left?" I had answered by signing on the dotted line. I turned into the South Ridge Heights neighborhood. Home. The car lurched up the slightly uneven driveway, the cracked concrete I hadn't fixed because the money had been diverted elsewhere for years. The porch light flickered, a loose wire from last year. I still hadn't gotten around to fixing it. Inside, the house was silent. No scent of essential oils like at Eric's place. No laughter. No Evelyn. I flipped on the kitchen light. The fluorescent bulb hummed dryly. The ceiling was old. The walls needed a new coat of paint. Everything could be renovated, if I had the money. The phone rang as I was taking out my keys. The screen lit up. Vanessa Simmons. I stared at the name for a moment, not declining, not answering, just letting it ring, letting her wait. I had waited 5 years for them. Couldn't a phone call wait for me? The ringing stopped. I sat down in the old dining chair. Silent. For the first time in years, I began to feel that the silence wasn't scary. It was just real. The phone rang again just as I finished pouring a glass of water from the filter pitcher. Still her. Vanessa Simmons. I let it ring 3 times before I picked up. No rush. No need. Franklin. Her voice was as sweet as diluted syrup. The same tone she used every time she needed money for car insurance, the gas bill, or an online yoga course. "I'm listening." "About the misunderstanding between you and Eric today." "Misunderstanding?" I leaned against the kitchen counter, still in my coat. "I thought you were perfectly clear." "It's not like that. I mean, it might have been a bit sensitive from your side." There was a rustling of paper bags in the background. "You know, my parents are very traditional." I stayed silent, waiting for the next part. Her version of the truth. "Honestly," she paused for effect, "they're not used to the way you do things, like food with too many spices, or music that's too loud. Besides," she lowered her voice as if confiding in me, "they're educated people. They like to talk about culture, books, and art. You, well," I cut her off. "I'm not qualified to join the conversation, is that it?" "I'm not saying that. It's just, given the circumstances, you understand, don't you?" I looked down at the kitchen floor. A few of the ceramic tiles were chipped at the edges. No money to replace them. Never felt the need to. Until today. "You don't see anything wrong with me being excluded from a party I indirectly paid for?" Her voice turned defensive. "I just want to keep the atmosphere right. My parents don't mix well with common things. And my former mother-in-law, Evelyn, she knew that. She knew how to stay quiet when needed." I stood up straight. "What did you just say about my wife?" She hesitated. "I'm just saying she understood her place better, knew her role." I gripped the phone tightly. No shouting, no trembling. Just a cold sensation shooting from my spine down to my palm. "Evelyn had more dignity in her little finger than your entire Simmons family name combined." "Oh, come on." She let out a dry laugh. She was a cleaner. You talk as if she were… Enough. My voice was low, very low. Listen to me carefully, Vanessa. I walked out of the kitchen and into the living room, where the single floor lamp still cast a warm, yellow glow. We have nothing left to pretend about. There are no more roles to play. You can't. I can, and I just did. I hung up, not forcefully, not in a rush. Just a gentle end to a conversation that was never equal. The space around me seemed to expand. I pulled open the drawer next to the dining table. I took out the stack of papers I had tried to avoid for 5 years. Mortgage agreements, bank statements, credit card receipts, proof of every dollar I had ever sent to help them. I sat down, turned on the desk lamp. For the first time in years, I started counting again. Not the money, but every time I had made myself invisible to preserve what they called family. I sat there in the dim yellow light cast from the corner of the room, the same spot where I used to read stories to Eric when he was 5. The armchair was the same old one. The cushion was indented on the right armrest, where Evelyn used to rest her arm every winter evening. Everything was still there, but the feeling wasn't. I looked down at the pile of papers on the table. Bank statements, credit card debt notices, receipts for contributions to the house in Southridge Heights that I was never considered an owner of. I used to think it was a necessary sacrifice, that I was investing in my son. Every time I signed another paper, I told myself, he needs me. But now it was clear. What Eric needed was for me to be silent and pay on time. I wasn't angry about being excluded from the party. I was angry because how had I raised him to become the man he was today? I remembered when he first learned to ride a bike. I was always right behind him, holding the seat steady. The first time he competed in the academic decathlon, I stayed up late, folding copies of old exam papers. I wasn't rich, but I had time. I had presence. And now, the only place I was present was on their bank statements, as the payer. Evelyn used to say, "Don't think of your son like a bank." I'd laughed. But I had. I'd given him interest-free, no collateral, no term loans, and received not a single word of thanks. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the streetlights were on. The houses along Henderson Drive began to play holiday music, and the smell of burning wood wafted through the cracks of my old wooden door. An elderly couple was pulling a box of decorations onto their lawn. The husband was hanging lights while his wife held the ladder. They said something to each other, then laughed together. No expensive car, no floor-to-ceiling windows, just each other. I turned back to look at my own room, the old wedding photo hanging slightly crooked, the porcelain tea set with a crack in its rim. Part of me wanted to tidy up. Another part thought, it was fine as it was. Everything was old, but at least it was mine. For the first time in a long time, my house felt truly peaceful. I no longer felt like a temporary resident in someone else's life. No one was telling me to change to be more presentable. I sat back down in the chair, pulled out a blank sheet of paper. I needed to write, not to send to anyone, but to remember what was worth keeping and what needed to be let go. To remember a father who once believed that if he was just kind enough, just patient enough, he wouldn't be left behind. Now I knew kindness needs boundaries. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. The sky was still misty, as Knoxville was in its coldest days. I made coffee with the old kettle that was missing its handle, then opened my laptop. The screen booted up as slowly as ever. But today, I had all the patience in the world. I navigated to the recurring payments section of my online banking portal. The first line appeared. Auto transfer, Eric Moore, $2,800 per month. Start date, January 3rd, 2021. I stared at the number for a long time, not because it was large, but because I couldn't remember the last time my son had thanked me. Maybe when he was still using that money for college? And now? He called it a post-marital allowance. I moved the cursor to the Cancel Automatic Transfer button. One click. A dialog box appeared. Are you sure you want to stop this payment? I clicked Confirm without hesitation. When the dialog box disappeared, I felt strangely lighter, as if a stone had been lifted from my chest. I continued. Canceled Vanessa's supplementary credit card, the one she used to book flights to a yoga conference in Atlanta, or to buy a set of crystal wine glasses for the aesthetic. I even went into the family phone plan section and discovered I was also paying for their home Wi-Fi. No problem. It only took a few more clicks to end that too. As I leaned back in my chair, my hands were still trembling slightly. Not because I missed the money, but because I realized I had let this go on for far too long. I opened a drawer and pulled out a folder of receipts. Things I had kept as evidence, but had never used. Hospital bills from when Vanessa gave birth, the payment for the contractor who installed the backyard sunshade, even the invoice for repainting their living room wall, a color Vanessa wanted to change to stay on trend. I gathered them all and put them in a document pouch, not to demand repayment, but to remind myself what I had given away. I looked at the phone on the table. It had been silent since last night's call. Eric hadn't called back. Vanessa hadn't texted. I wasn't surprised. I stepped outside, the cold wind hitting my cheeks. But for the first time, my face didn't feel numb with humiliation, but with the crisp air. I walked to Oak National Bank, the place where I had signed countless guarantee forms for them. The teller remembered me. "Mr. Moore, it's been a while." I smiled faintly. This time, I'm here to stop something, not start it. I pulled the copies of the power of attorney from my coat pocket. I want to cancel all credit guarantees related to Eric Moore and Vanessa Simmons. From this day forward, anything in their name. I have nothing to do with it. She nodded slowly, a little surprised, but she didn't ask questions. As I signed the last form, I looked up, feeling as if I had just let go of a heavy suitcase I once thought were wings. I walked out of the bank. The sun was breaking through the clouds. For the first time in years, I felt like I was walking without dragging anyone behind me. I was enjoying my second cup of Earl Grey tea for the day when the phone rang, signaling a call from Vanessa. I let it ring a few more times before picking up. "Dad, I need you to pick up my parents from the Knoxville airport this afternoon. They're flying in from Portland, landing at 2 p.m. Alaska Air, baggage claim 3. I set my teacup down, watched the thin wisp of steam rise from the surface, and then replied, "Vanessa, have you already forgotten our conversation from last week?" Her voice was steady, as if no confrontation had ever occurred. "That was emotional, Dad. This is practical. They need a ride, and you're the only one in the family who's free in the afternoon." I smiled, not because it was funny, but because her audacity had reached a level of near casualness. Yesterday, I was unworthy of stepping into their house. Today, I was the backup driver on their staff roster. "You're asking because that's what family does," she cut in, her tone suddenly sharp. "We help each other. And realistically, you're not busy. You're not an equal player in this family, so just do the right thing." I didn't argue. It wasn't necessary. "Alaska Air, you said?" "Yes, Flight 447. And remember, they have heavy luggage. Don't embarrass me. Oh, and you should dress nicely. That blue shirt you wore to Eric's graduation would be good. My parents notice these things." She hung up without a thank you. I sat still for a moment, watching the wall clock, which read 10:52 a.m. Still more than 3 hours until the flight lands. I poured more tea, added a spoonful of sugar, and reopened yesterday's newspaper to the half-finished crossword puzzle. 7 across. Deliberate forbearance. 12 letters. I nodded to myself. The answer might not come immediately, but it would. just like what they were about to receive. I had just finished the last down clue of the morning crossword when I heard a car screech to a halt outside. Less than 10 seconds later, there was a knock on the door. Rapid, impatient. I stood up, calmly placed my teacup on the table, and pulled back the curtain slightly. Eric's shiny black SUV was parked crookedly, half on the grass. And standing on my porch were the three faces whose vacations, parties, and leather living room sofa I had helped sponsor. Brent Simmons in a tailored gray suit, his hands clenched into fists. Gloria in a pale fur coat, her lips pursed as if she smelled something unpleasant. And behind them, Vanessa, unmasked and undisguised. Her face was hard, like someone who had just been publicly humiliated. I opened the door. I didn't invite them in. Brent was the first to speak. "Mr. Moore, your behavior this morning was completely unacceptable." I tilted my head. "Because I didn't chauffeur you from the airport?" Gloria stepped forward, cutting off her husband. "We were left standing in the middle of the airport like beggars. What do you think that says?" "It says you've grown accustomed to treating others like service staff," I replied, my eyes locked on hers. Vanessa snapped, "You deliberately humiliated my parents. I simply refused to be the backdrop for your family's wannabe aristocrat reception." Brent scoffed. "I see. This is all about pride. A lonely old man, thinking he can act high and mighty to demand a little respect." I stepped out onto the porch, meeting their gaze at eye level. I don't need respect in words from people whose hearts are filled with contempt. I don't demand affection from those who only see me as a means to an end. Gloria smirked. "You're so petty. And you, from start to finish, have only seen me as an ATM with a beard." All three of them froze. Vanessa's face turned red, whether from anger or from hearing me speak this way for the first time. I continued, my voice even, not loud, but as sharp as a thin blade. "You don't need to come to my house ever again. None of you are welcome guests here. And as of today, the financial ties between me and your self-proclaimed intellectual family are officially severed." Brent took a step forward. "Are you kicking us out?" "I'm not kicking you out. I'm simply giving back the distance you created." Vanessa turned to my son, just as Eric got out of the car. "Aren't you going to say something? Your father is making a scene." Eric looked at me. Not angry, not defensive, just silent. I nodded at him, as one would to a grown man. "You made your choice. So have I." Then I turned and went back inside. No need to slam the door. The wooden door closed on its own. Slowly, just enough for me to hear the click of Gloria's heels on the gravel path and the roar of the car engine down the street. For the first time, I didn't feel left behind. I felt like I had walked away as a free man. That evening, I sat in the living room, most of the lights off. Only the glow from the electric fireplace illuminated the worn edges of the wool rug Evelyn had picked out at a craft fair in Nashville. In the quiet darkness, I suddenly remembered another evening, almost 2 years ago. A family dinner at an Italian restaurant Vanessa had booked. The wine flowed freely. The polite compliments sparkled like the crystal glasses on the table. And Brent, after dessert, had leaned across the table, his voice as steady as if he were talking about golf. "You know, the construction industry in Knoxville isn't that big. People with a good reputation thrive, and those who do something unusual, well, word gets around fast." I had looked up at him. His eyes never left his wine glass as he swirled it gently. "I'm not saying this because of you. Of course. It's just some of my old friends are on the project approval board. They often mention subcontractors who were late on deadlines or had financial troubles." At the time, I just smiled. I thought it was a clumsy joke after a few drinks, but now I understood. It was a carefully chosen warning. No shouting, no cursing, but sharp enough to cut deep. Brent was always like that. He wouldn't raise a hand, but someone else's hand would be raised for him. He wouldn't push, but he'd always be standing at the bottom of the hill waiting to see who slipped. I stood up, poured some water, and stared at the wall calendar. December. The red circle around the 24th. Christmas. It was still there, circled at the beginning of the year, when I still thought I'd be sitting at the same table as my son, eating the turkey I'd roasted. Now I knew. That table was never big enough for both love and ambition. Brent and Gloria didn't just see me as a burden. They saw me as a social liability. A widowed father, an old-school tradesman, too kind for his own good, and who didn't know his place. In their eyes, I didn't fit the image they were trying to build, an upper-class, modern, tight-knit family, untainted by the stain of working-class love. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just awake. I understood that this was no longer a private matter within four walls. It was no longer a small conflict between two generations. This was a war, a quiet, unofficial one, between those who were proud of what they built with their own hands and those who built their reputations on the backs of others. This Christmas, I won't be attending their party. I would be rebuilding my own position, not in their hearts, but in my own. On the morning of December 22nd, I opened the door to my porch, the early morning chill cold enough to leave a layer of frost on the iron handle. The Knox County Gazette lay neatly in the mailbox, the paper still smelling of fresh ink. As I poured my tea, I quickly flipped to page 3. A bold headline at the top of the Community and Ethics section made my hand freeze. Elderly couple abandoned at Knoxville Airport in the dead of winter. Relative fails to arrive as promised. Beneath it were two photos side by side. One of Brent and Gloria Simmons pulling their suitcases on the airport sidewalk, slightly blurry, clearly taken in a hurry. Next to it was a cropped photo from my old company's website. My face turned to the side, looking haggard and unsympathetic in a deliberate way. I sat down and read in silence. The article claimed that an elderly couple, after a long flight from Portland, was stood up by a relative who had promised to pick them up. They were left stranded for nearly an hour in freezing weather conditions with no seating and no assistance. I looked up at the window. The thermometer outside my porch read 48 degrees Fahrenheit, almost 9 degrees Celsius. Not exactly spring weather, but certainly not a perilous winter night as the article described. I reread the headline. Dead of winter. But their flight had landed at 2 p.m. in broad daylight. There was sun, people around, and a line of taxis waiting. The truth was right there, but most readers would only see the headline. They wouldn't check the weather in Knoxville on December 21st. They wouldn't notice that I was never quoted in the article. The story wasn't written to inform. It was written to manipulate emotions. And I knew who did it. Brent Simmons. He didn't need to name me directly. He just had to plant the seed of doubt. A man, identified as Franklin M., a retired construction contractor living in the North Knoxville area. That was enough to make the connection. The article ended with a chilling line. The relative was reportedly contacted beforehand with the pickup request, but failed to show up and did not return calls. There has been no comment from the person in question. I chuckled softly. They hadn't contacted me, hadn't asked, but they had printed it. One-sided, cold, and entirely intentional. I folded the newspaper. I didn't tear it, didn't react. I just understood. The war was no longer confined to the family. Brent was no longer using condescending tones after dinner. He had gone public and chosen the press as his weapon. I no longer had the luxury of sitting still, and I no longer had any reason to remain silent. I sat at my desk, the phone placed right next to a pile of papers. The screen still showed Eric in my contacts. A simple name, no emojis, no profile picture. Just Eric, my son. My finger touched the call button. I paused. A part of me, torn and exposed by this morning's article, still wanted to believe that my son didn't know, that Brent had acted alone and Eric was innocent, or at least forced, or manipulated. I was about to press the button, but then, like an old tape rewinding in my head, I heard his voice, low and tired after an argument last winter. "Dad, can you just let it go, please? Don't say anything. Don't make a scene. Just keep the peace for the family." Back then, I fell silent. I did let it go. I played the part. I sat through dinner with Brent as if he hadn't belittled me with every sentence. I smiled at Gloria when she complimented me on staying in good shape for a retiree. I let Vanessa interrupt me 3 times and still nodded along. All of it, to keep the peace for the family. A pre-packaged peace, censored by others, where I was the silent extra. I looked back at the phone screen. I still hadn't called. I understood now. It takes 2 hands to reconnect. And if only one hand reaches out while the other stays in a pocket, that's not reconciliation. That's being dragged back into an old role. I put the phone down. No call, no apology, no explanation, no letting it go to keep the peace. Because if the family only existed when I was willing to be silent, then it was never a home. It was just a temporary stage. This time, I wasn't playing a part anymore. There are some winter evenings so quiet I can hear the second hand ticking on the wall clock, as if time itself is slowing down to make way for something shifting. Not loudly, not clearly, just a subtle change in the air that lets you know you can never go back. Tonight was one of those nights. I sat in my study, the room that used to be Evelyn's library, now filled with the cold light of a computer screen and the sound of rustling paper, where I began the quietest audit of my life. I leaned back, my eyes scanning the computer screen where the evidence was laid out. They had made 3 fatal mistakes. First, they had underestimated me, severely. Second, they had struck first, publicly and intentionally, which meant I had the right to strike back just as publicly. Third, and their most irredeemable mistake, they had documented their entire privileged lifestyle on social media themselves, a perfect catalog of their hypocrisy. I opened the photo album I had saved from Vanessa's account. The ceiling-high Christmas tree, champagne pouring into crystal flutes, a Persian rug, an off-season trip to Santa Fe. Captions like, "Hard work means treating yourself," all with my fingerprints on them, which she never acknowledged. I switched to the open spreadsheet. $48,000. The down payment for the house in Riverbend Estates. Not a gift, but the result of me cashing out a portion of my retirement savings, just because Eric had called in the middle of the night saying, "I don't want Vanessa's parents to think I'm financially incompetent." $2,800 a month regularly for 36 months. Not an obligation, not exactly support. It was more like a membership fee for me to retain the title of dad that they were chipping away at day by day. Total, over $100,000. Add to that the $29,000 for furniture, over $6,000 for a kitchen remodel, preschool tuition, private insurance, a few vacations, and extra help for every holiday. When I added it all up, the number exceeded $140,000, almost triple what I'd spent on myself in a decade. My phone vibrated, an unknown number. I didn't need to check. It could be Vanessa, it could be Brent, trying a different number to smooth things over. I ignored it. Instead, I printed every file, bank statements, receipts, screenshots of posts. I even added the recent article from the Knox County Gazette, the one they had planted through a contact in the industry to portray me as a difficult old man with erratic behavior, whose children had cut contact due to his concerning actions. I printed it out and, with a red pen, wrote in the margins, "False, lacks context, fabricated," one by one, like a teacher grading a poor essay. I prepared 12 copies, each one an inch thick, one for each guest. I looked at the calendar, December 24th, circled in red. Not because it was Christmas, but because it was the perfect day for everything to come to light. Vanessa had once posted on Facebook, "A cozy dinner with our loved ones." The guest list was public: friends, partners, neighbors, people of the same class, the same mindset, who enjoyed the beautifully edited stories in the press. I would bring them a different version, unpolished, unedited, and brutally honest. I closed my laptop, went to the kitchen, and took out my leather briefcase and the gray-blue suit Evelyn had picked out for me 10 Christmases ago. Tomorrow, they would see exactly what happens when you choose to attack a man who once thought silence was the way to preserve a family, until he realized that a family should never be built on blind endurance. I arrived at Riverbend Estates after dark. The Knoxville Christmas Eve air was cold like a damp cloth from the freezer. Silent, slow, but chilling to the bone. The streetlights cast a soft yellow glow. A few houses were still playing carols. But this exclusive neighborhood was politely quiet, as if even sound had been filtered by class. I parked 2 houses down, turned off the engine, and didn't bother with a coat. The cold kept me sharp. The leather briefcase sat on the passenger seat, heavy not with the weight of the paper, but with the meaning of every sheet inside. Each printout was a year I had stood in the wings, catching them from financial falls they pretended never happened. I walked up the steps to Eric's house just as laughter erupted from within. The clinking of crystal glasses, the sound of Vanessa's raised voice. "Cheers to family!" And in that brief moment, standing behind the door, I realized a simple truth. I was not included in their definition of family. I knocked 3 times, not hard, and without waiting. No one came to the door. I turned the handle myself. It was unlocked. I walked in like someone who used to have a key. The living room was dazzling with light, the chandelier I had helped pay to replace early last year. The Christmas tree reached the ceiling, its white lights blinking with the precision of a smartphone app. The space looked like it was straight out of a holiday furniture ad. Everything in its place, perfect, clean, luxurious, and completely devoid of me. I walked slowly down the hallway and into the dining room. 12 people. Men in blazers, women in red velvet or black silk dresses. Red wine was poured. A roasted turkey sat in the center of the table, with thinly sliced cold cuts and bread in a white cloth-lined wicker basket. The party was flawless, except for my unexpected presence. Eric looked up first. His eyes met mine, and his hand froze mid-air. Vanessa turned her head, her lips parting to say something, then closing again. Brent Simmons set his glass down very gently, the move of a man trying to appear in control. Gloria glanced at her husband, then at me, as if waiting for someone to clean up a technical error. No one invited me to sit. I didn't need an invitation. I opened my briefcase and took out the 12 dossiers. No gift bags, no ribbons, no business cards. I walked around the table, slowly, placing a folder in front of each person. Some of the guests thought it was the dessert menu. But as they opened them, silence fell over the room like ice shattering on water. The first page? A bank statement? The next? A screenshot of a social media post. The third? Receipts for a kitchen remodel, a furniture invoice, tuition fees, and a trip to Miami. And at the very end, the newspaper article from December 22nd, the printout marked up in red. False. Lacks context. Fabricated. I stood at the head of the table. The light from the chandelier shone on my shoulders, but my voice needed no light to be heard clearly. I didn't come for dinner. I'm not hungry. I didn't come to ask for my money back. I just want everyone, all of you raising a glass to family, to know who is behind everything on this table. No one laughed. No one poured more wine. Eric whispered, "Dad." I cut him off with a look. No anger, no trembling. I continued. For 3 years, I said nothing, because I thought if I took a step back, you would step forward. But I kept stepping back, and all I got in return was a newspaper article. written by someone who doesn't know me, based on the words of people who never paid me a dime. I placed a single, unlabeled red gift box in front of Brent. He didn't need to open it. I didn't need him to react. I glanced around one last time. I looked at each face, each averted gaze. Then I said my final words, like a verdict. I did the right thing for so long that the people around me thought I had no limits. But you were all mistaken. I do have limits. And tonight, I came to remind you of that. I nodded and turned to leave. The house behind me was still bright, but that light no longer belonged to me. The door closed behind me. The cold night wind blew across my face. I walked down each step, not rushing, not looking back. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was carrying nothing on my back. I left without needing to look back. But I wasn't the only one who left. In the house behind me, silence no longer served its purpose of concealment. It began to crack, first in the shifting eyes, then spreading to the hands that had held wine glasses with satisfaction, now setting them down gently, as if the sound itself was an accusation. From what I know, and true to the instincts of someone who spent his life in the construction business, a reputation doesn't collapse because of one article or one scandal. It collapses because of the downward glances at the exact moment everyone else is looking up. And that's precisely what happened that night. Brent Simmons, the man who had played the role of a social benefactor, the name behind scholarships and charity auctions, was now exposed at his own dinner table, not by slander, but by the very receipts he had encouraged his daughter to send me. Gloria Simmons, who always smiled gently and emphasized the value of propriety and decorum, now had to sit straighter than usual to keep herself from trembling under the gazes that pierced through her flawless makeup. One of the guests, a real estate investment partner I guessed, was the first to put down the dossier. He said nothing. He simply removed the napkin from his lap, stood up, and left through the side door. No one stopped him. Not because they were embarrassed, but because no one had the authority to stop him anymore. The next to leave was a blonde woman, a friend of Vanessa's, who had shared many articles from the Knox County Gazette. She flipped to the Facebook photo of Vanessa showing off her "Treat Yourself for a Great Year" ring. Next to it was the receipt from the jewelry store, with the payer's name, Franklin Moore. I don't know what she said, but I heard a sigh and her final words echoing from the hallway. "I thought you people were different. Turns out you're all the same." The silence that followed was a form of punishment that no one in the Simmons household had ever been trained to endure. Vanessa sat motionless. She stared at the dossier in front of her, as if not turning the page would make the truth disappear. But the truth doesn't vanish just because it's ignored. It was there, bold, clear, with numbers and receipts, and with photos she herself had posted. Eric said nothing. His hands were still on the table, but his thumb tapped lightly on the glass surface. An unsteady rhythm, an admission that he knew this was coming. He just didn't expect it so soon. Brent sat still, his eyes no longer meeting anyone's. The man who once entered every room with the posture of someone in control now sat like a shareholder who had just been kicked off the board. Not because he lost, but because no one believed him anymore. Gloria managed to stammer, "Everyone, there might be a misunderstanding." But even her own voice didn't believe it. It broke mid-sentence, like a thin glass filled with liquid that was too hot. And I didn't need to be there to witness what happened next. Because all masks fall off the same way. Not with a bang, but with a quiet crumbling, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to cling to a person's face. March. Knoxville entered its characteristically quiet spring. No fireworks, no chirping birds, just damper air, drier roads, and young leaves beginning to tremble in the wind as if hesitating whether to bloom or wait a few more weeks. I woke up at 6:10 a.m., brewed a pot of black coffee, cut a slice of the dark bread left over from Thursday. opened the kitchen window. It was misty outside, damp but pleasant. I wasn't in a hurry, not because I was retired, but because I was no longer obligated to please anyone. In the mailbox was a cream-colored envelope with the Oak National Bank logo in the corner. The recipient's name was Franklin Moore, but I knew the letter wasn't for me. Inside was a copy of a notification of overdue payment on mortgage loan number 72,396, belonging to Eric and Vanessa Moore. If no corrective action is taken within 30 days, the bank will initiate foreclosure proceedings as per the terms of the contract. I folded the letter, placed it next to my coffee cup, said nothing, thought nothing of it. It was just an inevitable part of the natural order. I remembered the last time I paid the mortgage for that house, $2,800 last November, right before the article was published. After that, there were no more thanks, no more check-in texts, just silence, and a veiled comment from Brent about my instability, sent to a reporter who didn't know half the truth. Now the silence had returned to its rightful place. On my kitchen table, in this house, with me, alone and free. I took a sip of coffee. Bitter. Just right. I opened the newspaper. The Knox County Gazette, Sunday edition. The front page featured a new housing development on the east side of the city. The very same land I had declined to consult on 3 years ago, because Vanessa wanted Grandpa to stay home and babysit for the summer. I skimmed the article and saw the names of a few old colleagues. Still doing well. The project seemed to be thriving. I folded the paper, no regrets. Life isn't measured by the opportunities you miss. It's measured by stopping at the right time and no longer bowing your head for someone who doesn't deserve it. I stood up, emptied the coffee grounds, washed my hands under the cold tap. No need to check my email, no need to make a call, because from now on, peace was no longer found in holding on to others. It was found in pulling myself out of the cycle of blind sacrifice. 3 months had passed since Christmas Eve. I lived alone, making coffee every morning, reading the paper, mowing the lawn, watering the plants. No one called, no one asked. No one needed me in the background anymore, and I no longer felt the need to be there. That morning, I was cleaning up the garden when I heard a car pull up. A gray sedan stopped at the curb. It wasn't shiny anymore. It looked like it had been hastily washed, with dry leaves still stuck to the wipers. Eric got out. No ironed shirt, no tie, no blazer. Just a man who looked like he was no longer trying to prove anything. He stood still for a few seconds, not waving, not calling out, before slowly walking up the porch steps. "I know you don't want to see me, but I didn't know where else to go." I nodded, asked no questions, and opened the door to let him in. We sat at the dining table. No coffee, no pastries, just 2 glasses of water between us. Eric looked down at his glass, swirling it gently before speaking without beating around the bush. I was wrong. Not just for not speaking up, but for letting someone else write the narrative and then staying silent as it spread. When you walked in that night, I couldn't say anything because I knew you saw everything. And I had no defense. He looked up. His eyes were dark-rimmed, his voice hoarse. Vanessa moved back to her mother's. I'm living in a small rental apartment on the east side. I'm not here to ask for help. I just don't want to lose you completely. I looked at him. No longer the man who stood behind the high-class party at Riverbend, nor the little boy who used to beg for expensive toys. Just my son, sitting there, battered and defenseless. I remained silent for a moment, then said slowly, "You know, I raised you, loved you, sacrificed for you. And then one day, you let your wife's family convince you that this father wasn't good enough to be present at their dinner. Eric." I said his name for the first time in our meeting. "You didn't lose me. You gave me away. There's a difference." He bowed his head, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. No arguments, no excuses. I didn't need to hear any more. Not because everything was clear, but because the time for words to explain things was over. I quietly pushed the water pitcher toward him, a small sign that some doors, though once closed, could still be cracked open if both sides were willing to step closer. The next morning, Eric returned. I was cleaning my gardening tools when I heard the car pull up to the curb. The same gray sedan as yesterday, still with a layer of dust on the rear window. But this time, he got out faster, with a notebook and a pen in hand. He looked like he'd gotten some sleep. Or maybe he'd made up his mind. We sat on the porch steps. I didn't beat around the bush. It's good that you want to start over with me. But starting over doesn't mean going back to the way things were. Because the old way is what broke everything. He nodded without reacting. I continued. From now on, no one is carrying you. No automatic transfers, no loan guarantees, no more. It's just temporary, Dad. If you want to live like a man, you have to get your hands dirty like a real man. I told him about an old building supply store on the east side of Knoxville. The owner was a friend of mine and needed someone for inventory. Morning shift, 6 days a week. The pay wasn't high, but it was steady. Come summer, they'd need an extra hand for deliveries. No glamour, no startup, no air-conditioned office, no glass desks. You don't have to do it forever, I said. But if you don't start at the bottom, don't expect to climb anywhere. He sat quietly for a moment, then opened his notebook. He wrote down the phone number. No complaints, no excuses. He didn't ask if there was anything else he could do. I noticed his hand trembled slightly as he wrote. Not from fear, but because it had been a long time since he'd touched something that wasn't polished. What about the Riverbend house? He asked. I shook my head. That's a lesson, not real estate. He lowered his head and asked no more questions. Before he stood up to leave, he said softly, his voice almost breaking, If you don't believe in me anymore, I understand. I didn't look at him directly, just replied, I don't need you to prove anything to me. You just need to prove something to yourself. He nodded and quietly walked away. For the first time, I watched him leave without a sense of worry. Not because I was sure he would succeed, but I had stopped doing it for him. Spring arrives in Knoxville without a rush. The mornings are still cool, but the afternoon sun is warmer, enough for people to shed a layer and linger a little longer on their porches. On the oak tree in my front yard, the first green buds have appeared. And on the stone path in the backyard, sparrows have started to land more often, as if they too have realized the season has finally changed. I had dinner with my cousin Clara Jennings's family. We sat around a long wooden table in a kitchen that smelled of chicken soup and was filled with soft yellow light. The meal was simple. Mashed potatoes, baked salmon, a plate of butter-sautéed green beans. But it was cozy in a way that required no one to prove anything to anyone. My two young grandnephews sat across from me, talking nonstop about their science presentations at school. One raised his hand to demonstrate how to imitate a signal from Mars, while the other laughed and tried to explain it. I didn't interrupt. I just listened, smiled, and realized I no longer felt empty after a family conversation. Clara poured more tea, her hand gently patting my shoulder, a habit she's had since we were kids. You're looking better, Frankie. I gave a small nod. Nothing more needed to be said. No one at this table asked me about Riverbend. No one mentioned the article. No one was curious about the mortgage or last year's Christmas Eve dinner. They didn't need me to recount the story for pity or defense. They just needed me to be there, not to give, but to sit with them like a normal person among people who loved me. I used to think my legacy was the Riverbend house I helped my son keep, that my legacy was the $2,800 a month, or the wedding ring of Evelyn's I had planned to leave for my grandchild. Now I understand. A true legacy isn't what you leave behind, but how you finally lived. And I am living. No longer the man rejected by his own family. No longer the name distorted in the papers. No longer the shadow behind someone else's feast. I am Franklin Moore, the man listening to children talk about school, eating dinner under a kitchen light, sipping warm tea in a house that isn't large, but where no one disrespects his presence anymore. Spring is coming, and for the first time in years, I don't have to force myself to do anything. Just being present is enough. If you sympathized with the father in this story, a man who sacrificed in silence, then stood up to reclaim his respect, please like this video. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. To hear the next story, click on the video on the left.